The solitary, steep hill called Corona Heights was black as pitch and very silent, like the heart of the unknown. It looked steadily downward and northeast, away at the nervous, bright lights of downtown San Francisco, as if it were a great predatory beast of night surveying its territory in patient search of prey.
That was the opening paragraph of the award-winning novel Our Lady of Darkness by Fritz Leiber, Jr. My name is Prudence Priest. For the next hour, we will be acquainting you with the life and work of Fritz Leiber, Jr., a grand master of science fiction and fantasy. I first met Fritz while managing the downtown San Francisco apartment building in which he lived. From that point on, I have been blessed by a deep and abiding friendship with this brilliant man. When we first met, I was unaware of his fame as a writer, but I was attracted by the commanding presence of this stately old gentleman as he strolled through the lobby of our building. When called to investigate a plumbing problem, he graciously ushered me into a small studio literally bursting with books and quite a few small statues, some of them used as bookends. In the midst of this, in a carefully chosen place of honor, stood a collection of beautifully rendered statues of the Norse gods. I have a passionate interest in Norse mythology and religion, and was stunned to find someone in my own building who honored the old gods. At that moment, my friendship with Fritz Leiber began.
This award was from the British Science Fantasy Society.
For a best short story.
Yeah, the August Derleth Award, it's called. And later they changed it to this one. Larger and more sort of generally impressive.
Yes, yes.
But the same award. This is Lovecraft, the great American horror writer whose stories appeared almost entirely in Weird Tales, a pulp magazine. And it was established in 1975 at the first World Fantasy Convention. And it was done by Gahan Wilson, whom most of us know as a cartoonist who specializes in the weird and who did a page for Playboy for quite a long while.
Oh, yes.
So some of us from Fritz's San Francisco neighborhood got together to produce this video as a tribute and remembrance to this one-of-a-kind individual and great writer. It is our goal to reacquaint you, the viewer, with our friend and neighbor, Fritz Leiber.
You see, I became familiar with Shakespeare's plays as a small child because I heard my father rehearse the part of Hamlet the first time. Actually, I was about 4 years old, and he was playing Hamlet for the first time. It was the one time he was acting in Robert Mantell's company, and he persuaded.
Hi, I'm Lee, and no, I'm not the alien waif from the story, but I have been Fritz and Margo's housekeeper companion since 1990, and I have a little background information for you. Fritz Leiber Jr. was born on December 24th, 1910. It was the year Mark Twain died, Halley's Comet returned, and Perry reached the North Pole. You know, he was literally born into a world of fantasy and imagination. He was the only child of a family of traveling Shakespearean actors.
A drum, Macbeth doth come. We, the weird sisters, hand in hand, posters of the sea and land, thus to go about, thrice to thine, and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9. Peace, the charm's wound up. And then Macbeth and Banquo come in, and he says, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. What are these, so withered and so wild, that look like the inhabitants of the earth, yet are not?
He was a very bright kid. He was an only kid. And his parents, very glamorous parents, were off for 9 months of the year. Being stars. Yeah. And illustrious, dramatic, in the spotlight.
Hi, I'm Ted. I also used to manage Fritz's Geary Street building. At the age of 12, while visiting Denver, Fritz learned to play the game of chess. He says the game may have aggravated the rivalry he had with his father, but he really got into playing when he started at the University of Chicago. He played frequently at the Campus Reynolds Club and learned the game's fascinating history. His enthusiasm for chess would later lead him to use it as a vehicle in some of his best stories, like The Dreams of Albert Moreland, 1947, The 64 Square Madhouse, 1962, Night to Move, 1965, from the Change War series, and my favorite, Midnight by the Morphy Watch, 1974, a good old urban horror story set right here in San Francisco. But it was at the university while playing chess that Fritz met his lifelong friend, Harry Fisher.
Well, I can't totally answer that, because I didn't come up with these characters. My friend Harry Fisher, Harry Otto Fisher, did that. And he died a little after, the day after Discovery blew up. So we can't ask him, except at midnight sessions, that I profoundly missed out.
While in college, Fritz pursued interests in mathematics, physics, and psychology, but he graduated in 1932 with a degree in philosophy, and he was a Phi Beta Kappa.
Fritz has a first-rate academic mind. He had a good education, and his scientific education was first class. So in so many ways, he was not a peculiar thinker, an idiosyncratic or very narrow thinker. He was broad as the times, and in fact, in many ways, was ahead of his times.
His parents' theater company had just gone bust, along with many other businesses at the beginning of the Depression. With a sense of idealism, training as an actor, and under some economic pressure, Fritz took up religion. He was paid to attend the General Theological Seminary in New York City, while working as a lay reader and minister at 2 small Episcopal churches. But by his second semester, he had doubts about the whole business. At the end of the term, he returned to the University of Chicago for a scholarship. This religious experience would provide him with insights used in his upcoming novel, Gather Darkness. By 1934, it was the middle of the Depression, and Fritz was back on tour with his father's reconstituted theater company.
Fritz's father was, as you know, a great Shakespearean actor. Fritz, in his later youth, appeared with his father's company in his last season, which traveled on the Pacific coast. After that...
What parts did he play?
Oh, he played, well, he played the roles usually given to a developing young juvenile. He played Edgar in Lear. He played the Prince of Morocco in The Merchant of Venice. And he did a number of others. But then the stage and particularly traveling companies were getting pretty dead. It was the height of the Depression. People didn't have the money. Fritz's father ended his last tour in Los Angeles and headed for the films. Years earlier, many years earlier, Fritz's father had been in films in New York, in which he had played Julius Caesar to Theda Bara's Cleopatra.
I understand that Fritz himself actually had a bit of a Hollywood movie career.
Very much of a bit.
What did he do?
Well, one part he played was Robert Taylor's brother in Greta Garbo's Camille, which I think was 1936. And the trouble with Fritz as a young leading man in the movies was that he wasn't a star. He was obviously star quality. He had the height, he had the looks, he had the voice, and he had the talent. But you don't start out as a star. At any rate, you didn't in those days. So he had this part in Camille playing Robert Taylor's brother in one scene. Now, the only catch to this was Robert Taylor was 5'9". Fritz was 6'5". He played the part standing in a hole.
On this happy occasion, I ask you all to rise and drink a toast to the happiness of this family.
Well, sir. Health and happiness. And now may I propose the happiness of my dear sister and my dear friend, Louise and Valentine, who've known each other from childhood and are soon to be man and wife.
Louise and Valentine.
Thank you. Thank you.
After the tour stopped, Fritz again went back to the University of Chicago. There he met his future wife, Jonquil Ellen Stevens. They were married on January 18th, 1936, and that winter, Fritz finished his first Pfeffert and Mauser story, Adept's Gambit. This was not the first story to be published. It saw print almost 11 years later in 1947. Also, in 1936, Jonquil knew of Fritz's great respect and admiration for the work of H.P. Lovecraft. So she wrote to Mr. Lovecraft, introducing Fritz, and they both had a valuable correspondence with the horror writer until he died in 1937.
This is a portrait, a soft portrait of Lovecraft again, the guy there.
And he's got Cthulhu on his shoulder.
Yes, Cthulhu on his shoulder, and it was done by Susan Dexter, who's an artist who works in Newcastle, Pennsylvania.
What writers would you say inside science fiction fantasy that Fritz really admired?
Of course, first of all, H.P. Lovecraft, who really drew him into writing fantasy and horror. And he admired Lovecraft's work immensely. Jonquil, Fritz's first wife, wrote to Lovecraft and drew the two of them into a correspondence which didn't last too long but was very intensive while it went on. And Lovecraft, of course, was a phenomenon as far as young writers were concerned. Others he was in correspondence with included Kuttner, Bloch, a number of others. He encouraged them in their work. He read their work. He criticized it. He spent an immense amount of time and energy on getting them more into what they were doing, and it was wonderful. I think without it, perhaps Fritz might not have gone on, or at any rate would not have gone on in the way in which he did.
Their only son, Justin, was born on July 10th, 1938, and in 1939, Fritz had his first professional sale of a story. It was Two Sought Adventure, a Pfeffert and Mauser story that appeared in the August issue of Unknown magazine. Once again, they moved back to California as World War II was close at hand. Fritz had several jobs, including a position at Occidental College, teaching speech and drama. His faculty experience gave him insight for his first novel, Conjure Wife. Both it and his novel, Gather Darkness, sold to the famous editor, John W. Campbell, Jr. They appeared in 1943, Conjure Wife in Unknown and Gather Darkness in Astounding.
Gather Darkness, just conceptually, remains one of the most brilliant pieces of science fiction ever written. Let's see, my mother worked for many years in the library of a small college, so I think I am particularly able to appreciate the innate viciousness of Conjure Wife and its picture of academic life.
Why, there had been a dozen times during the early years when he had teetered on the brink of academic downgrade, when there had loomed some irreparable break with authority. Yet he had always managed to wiggle out, and almost always he could see with Tansy's clever roundabout aid. Ever since he had married her, his life had been luck, luck, luck. How the devil had she managed it?
That was from Fritz's first published novel, Conjure Wife. H.P. Lovecraft once said the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains. A certain dread of outer unknown forces must be present, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos. Conjure Wife is just this kind of good horror story. In the book, Norman Saylor is a young ethnologist at a small college. He represents a rational, scientific worldview. However, his wife, Tansy, and the other faculty wives are working with the forces of chaos while exposing a darker side of the feminine mystique. As Tansy points out, I know you'll think I'm being romantic and trite, but I've always felt that women were more primitive than men, closer to ancient feelings.
Brother Jarls, priest of the first and outermost circle, novice in the hierarchy, swallowed hard against the churning anger, bent every effort to make his face a mask, not only to the commoners, for that was something every member of the hierarchy was taught to do, but to his brother priests as well. Any priest who hated the hierarchy as he did during these frightening spasms of rage must be mad. But priests could not go mad, at least not without the hierarchy knowing about it, as it knew of everything else. This was Fritz's first science fiction novel, Gather Darkness, published just after Conjure Wife. It takes place on a future Earth where the military, scientists, and church have combined to create a religious dictatorship known as the hierarchy. Most people in this world are commoners, living in physical and intellectual poverty. Technology is used to trick and control commoners into continuing to believe in and support the religion. But there is a revolt against this system, also involving scientists, known as the witchcraft. Members of this conspiracy have familiars, who are attendant beings grown from their own tissue. Amazingly, Fritz is describing recombinant DNA and cloning prior to their discovery, 50 years before our biotechnology industry can produce a tomato.
When the two novels were published in 1943, Fritz had come to terms with his pacifist philosophy while taking a war-related job at a Southern California aircraft factory. He felt that all war was wrong, but that perhaps the war with Hitler was a necessary evil. By 1945, he was back in Chicago as associate editor of Science Digest. He would hold this job for 11 years. During this period, Conjure Wife and Gather Darkness were finally published as books, and he put out 3 new novels and a collection of short stories. His new novels were The Green Millennium, Destiny Times 3, and The Sinful Ones. Night's Black Agents was the short story collection, but he also published many other stories in magazines at the same time. They included such notables as Coming Attraction, The Girl with the Hungry Eyes, The Ship Sails at Midnight, and A Pail of Air. You must understand that Fritz was courageously coming out with writing displaying satirical, cynical, and political content during a period of witch hunts, blacklists, and Senator Joe McCarthy. For example, The Green Millennium features a young man named Phil Gish, whose life is forever changed by the appearance of a magical green cat, which he names Lucky. He lives in a future America full of agents for the Federal Bureau of Loyalty and the Federal Bureau of Morality, who are armed with lasers and heat-seeking missiles. 2 atomic wars have destroyed America's social structure, and these agencies are in place to maintain control with extensive surveillance on private citizens. The novel clearly reflects Fritz's anti-McCarthyism. By establishing Phil Gish as a sympathetic character endangered by a repressive government, Fritz cleverly uses the novel to strike a blow for personal freedom. The Green Millennium represents Fritz's humorous and satirical side. However, his social commentary becomes very powerful when expressed as a good horror story like The Girl with the Hungry Eyes. This 1949 story was re-released in 1968. It is narrated by a man who first took pictures of the girl, a model whose face is the rage of the advertising world. The American people just can't seem to get enough of her. This might be because she is actually a psychic vampire with eyes that can suck the life force right out of you.
My story, The Girl with the Hungry Eyes.
Yay!
That was inspired by, it was my reaction to Marshall McLuhan's first book, his, which was something called The Mechanical Bride, and didn't make a terrible stir in this country. I remember being delighted with it, but I couldn't find any favorable reviews to speak of. It was viewed as a sort of impertinent attack on American advertising by a Canadian.
Oh, but I think that story is still just as apt today. Because it's about advertising and how, the it girl, it was about the perfect woman and how she was on all the billboards. Everyone became obsessed with her. And it's no different today. I mean, models, it's still the in model of the year, Paulina, whatever her name is.
Yeah. They called her a girl.
I realized that wherever she came from, whatever shaped her, she's the quintessence of horror behind the bright billboard. She's the smile that tricks you into throwing away your money and your life. She's the eyes that lead you on and show you death. She's the creature you give everything for and never get. When you yearn towards her face on the billboard, remember that. She's the lure. She's the bait. She's the girl.
Coming Attraction features a world of man-woman fight matches and hot rods equipped with hooks ready to snatch pedestrians. The 2 superpowers have had a number of nuclear exchanges, and America is in the process of individually and collectively going insane. These stories from the early 50s have accurately anticipated many things that have happened or perhaps will happen. They have the distinct flavor of the later cyberpunk fiction of the likes of a William Gibson. Fritz's daring challenges to the times were not without their consequences. Ominously, editors began to tell him that readers were objecting to certain stories. His output considerably slowed between 1954 and 57.
In the 1950s, Fritz developed a deep and lasting friendship with the writer and editor Judith Merrill. Recently, at a local science fiction convention, the two friends got together again after a long absence.
So I was gobbling uppers and he was gobbling downers.
Yes, that's true, because I was on alcohol and barbiturates by that time. A combination, a fatal combination that I somehow survived.
Barely, because
Yes.
there's somewhere in there was when you were hospitalized with the blood poisoning as well.
Right.
This is 52 still, or?
What, when he was hospitalized? I don't know. It was
No,
in
that was
period.
later.
That was later.
That was at the end of my then drinking period. I was spending, now that was in 55 and 56.
You said you corresponded a lot over the years. Do you think that, were these just basically love letters, or were you also?
Oh, no.
They were much more.
Yeah, a few years ago.
Letters between artists.
Letters.
Do you still have them?
Yes, I had my letters acquired by the National Archives in Canada a few years ago. And looking through things before sending them up. One starts with the idea that one will not, at least initially, give them very personal things. But I found that with Fritz, as with a number of other people with whom there was less actionable material, the interweaving of the personal and the literary and intellectual and political was so complete in the letters that there was no way, there was no way that you could say this was a love letter, or this was a letter about what you were working on, or this was a letter about your ideas. Everything went together.
Fritz, you said that she was the inspiration for stories. Would you say that your relationship and your correspondences helped both of you as writers? Or?
Oh, God,
Oh, yes. Very definitely.
I mean, it's difficult. Is there a way to elaborate on that as to?
One would have to go back and look at the letters and look at, and see just when certain stories were written and reread them, because it isn't a simple thing like,
There's
thinking about
Judy
Fritz started this. I mean, half the time you don't recognize the character you wrote until after the story's written. So
Did you criticize each other? Did you, for instance, say I thought that story was a bad one, or?
Had I received something I thought was a bad one, I would have. I certainly said I like this better than that. But also during that period, I began doing doing a fair amount of anthology editing. So we then got into another level of relationship where I was buying his stories.
Buying my stories.
That was, but I was starting to say before, and we got sidetracked, that the particular story that I treasured through those years, where I was living in Milford and trying to put my life back together after the other episode left me in such a problem situation. I had no man of my own and could not have one because I was in a long drawn-out custody struggle, living in a small town. But I did have 5 fellow writer, good friends, with whom there was this kind of mix of literary and personal and emotional relationship. And so I kept saying to myself, well, I am the nice girl with 5 husbands.
So you like that story?
I love that story.
Nice girl with 5 husbands.
Nice girl with 5 husbands, and
well, I
what
recall.
What was the title of the one with E equals MC squared?
E equals MC squared.
Ball bouncing.
Wasn't that the?
Oh yes, that was the nice girl with
about
5
the
husbands.
children.
Right.
That worked up to the ending.
Yeah.
Of the first field equation of Einstein's.
I saw in your list of questions that one of the things you were curious about was which works one had liked best. For me, it's really been Fritz's science fiction. He is one of the very few authors whose fantasy I will read and enjoy. But the things that have moved me have been primarily science fiction, or in some cases science fantasy, the in-between things, like A Desk Full of Girls.
Oh, yes.
And Rump Titty Titty. And a nice girl, of course, Appointment in Tomorrow, The Beat Cluster, The Big Time.
Where you certainly were the principal inspiration for the narrator, the chief character of Greta Forzana.
Oh, yes?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
You don't know about the change war, but it's influencing your lives all the time. And maybe you've had hints of it without realizing. Have you ever worried about your memory because it doesn't seem to be bringing you exactly the same picture of the past from one day to the next? Have you ever been afraid that your personality was changing because of forces beyond your knowledge or control? Have you ever thought the universe might be a crazy, mixed-up dream? Well, if you have, you've had hints of the change war.
That was the character Greta Forzane from Fritz's novel The Big Time. It earned him his first Hugo Award for Best Science Fiction Novel in 1961. The book and related series of short stories make up what is known as the Change War series. Fritz came up with a new concept of time travel, conflicting with what seemed to be an established tradition in science fiction. Most other writers viewed time as a fragile entity, but in Fritz's stories, time-traveling soldiers confront the law of conservation of reality, where the flow of time is strong and inertia-prone. Single actions have little effect, and many changes are required to alter an historical outcome. In this way, Fritz conceives of a grand battle between two armies known as snakes and spiders, continuously fought through the past, present, and future throughout the entire universe. Characters caught up in these change winds experience great internal conflicts and insecurities. Placed in battles where direction and purpose are unknown, they are manipulated by forces they can never discover nor confront. One can see why those caught up in this grand conflict refer to it as the Big Time.
Fritz's fantasy influenced me, his horror stories in particular, the Pfafferding, Grey Mouser stories. His craftsmanship, his imagination, I think, more than anything else. His imagination is extraordinary, especially in stories like Smoke Ghost or almost any of the stories in the fantasy area, the science fiction field. All of them have been very important to me in the sense of being rich and colorful and innovative. A story like Coming Attractions just knocks your socks off when you first read it. So Fritz has been very important to the field.
Between 1961 and 1964, Fritz came out with 3 new collections: The Mind Spider and Other Stories, Shadows with Eyes, and A Pail of Air. There was also a new novel, The Silver Eggheads.
Stories that you remember from when you were very young, and sometimes you don't even remember what they're about. You just remember a very warm feeling that you got from reading them. And Fritz's work is certainly among those things that made me what I am.
In 1964, he again won a Hugo for Best Novel, The Wanderer. Fritz conceives of an artificial planet that has maneuvered into the moon's orbit for refueling. When the Wanderer devours the moon, the resulting physical and psychic effects on Earth are absolutely devastating. The story features Tigerishka, the sensual alien Catwoman. People of the Wanderer are rebels, fighting and fleeing an oppressive galactic civilization. In this book, Fritz's view of future civilization is quite negative, comparing the spread of intelligent life to that of algae in a pond. Such a view was unusual in science fiction up to that point.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the reasons I was asking you about the tides, I guess, is because I did read The Wanderer. And one of the things I noticed on all this stuff, because you write about stuff now, I get comments or criticism that, oh, well, that's all been done before. But of course, when you wrote it, it hadn't been done before.
That's right.
And the Wanderer was just fascinating, that the moon got captured and stolen and broken, and what would happen if the moon fell. You know, that's a...
Or if it got that close to Earth.
Right, right.
Though it would all take, presumably, quite a long time to be pulverized, and I had it all happening overnight.
Yes, yes. And that would cause outrageous tides. So you have to do lots of research on tides and things like that.
Right.
That is strange that the Atlantic tides are the same and the Pacific vary so long.
Yeah. It's all very strange.
In 1967, Fritz wins another Hugo Award and a Nebula Award for the story Gonna Roll the Bones, a horror story featuring a dice game with death. For over 50 years, Fritz has been writing stories about his two adventurers, the tall northern Pfefford and the small but cunning gray Mouser. With them, Fritz helped to broaden the category of heroic fantasy. In fact, he coined the term sword and sorcery to describe the literary backwater landscape his two heroes share with the likes of Howard's Conan the Barbarian. It is an imaginary world crowded with one-dimensional, muscle-bound oafs fighting gory battles with arcane forces. Fritz described some of the motivations for such heroes at a recent panel on this subject.
A hero is a young man who goes out into the world to seek adventure and who chiefly is looking for sexual satisfaction and seeking out maidens who will trade sex with him for heroic feats, deeds of daring do, just merely spectacular life risking of any sort, but particularly life risking that seems to benefit the maiden. He also is looking for gold and jewels and so on, but these are chiefly as gifts to the young women he desires. So I'd say that's the business a hero is in. Trading daring do for sexual satisfaction. It seems a very simple thing to me.
However, Fritz expanded the definition of heroic fantasy and challenged all the rules. Pfefford and the Mouser were more human, well-rounded fellows, identified as complex as well as intelligent. They raised the standards of sword and sorcery fiction and were acknowledged with a Hugo for the best novella, Ill Met, in Lankmar in 1970. The two brought with them to adventure fiction many new readers and attracted talented new writers.
He's been my hero for a long time because he writes such a wide spectrum of fantasy and writes it all well, as well as science fiction, it should be added, that, you know, he doesn't, I don't think he's ever felt limited to just one general area. I started reading Fritz Leiber as a teenager after a long bout of Conan the Barbarian and things like this that had these strong, muscular males and the beautiful, voluptuous women. And I enjoyed the fantasy, but didn't really find anything to identify with. But then you get into Pfefford and the Gray Mouser, and you have the Gray Mouser who is small and lithe and quick. And first I could identify him as a character, that you didn't have to be this huge muscular thing to be a hero. And the second thing was that all of a sudden somebody was writing about small-breasted women as if they were attractive. And, you know, this changes your image of yourself. You know, maybe, you know, I don't have to be able to fill brass breastplates in order to attract a hero of my own. Or I don't have to be huge and muscular to be a hero.
So after Fritz got out of the hospital, that's when he moved to 811 Geary.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was the setting for Our Lady of Darkness.
That certainly was.
Can you tell us a little bit about the building?
Well, it was a very old building, which had once been a hotel. And it had some rather spooky features, including closets and so on in the halls, which were painted black. It also had some of the characters that were in Our Lady of Darkness.
Oh, really?
Such as the Peruvian lady landlord, who was a real charmer and a very good friend of ours, and her daughter, who at that point was a child, but later now is a young lady. And it had its spooky features.
That was the novel where he advanced some rather interesting ideas about architecture, about the city being a generator of negative energy or something.
That's right.
Want to go into that a little bit and how the building might have figured into that?
Well, the building figured in that as a focus of this evil power, which somehow connected also with the San Francisco hills. And that was one spooky story. Another major character in it, by the way, was based on Donald Sidney Fryer. And then there were flashbacks to the days of San Francisco's artistic early Renaissance with people like Nora Mae French and Jack London.
Fritz is to a certain extent what you call a writer's writer. You will find among science fiction writers that people will mention him before they mention Asimov or Clarke. The same thing is true for me, to a great extent. I think Fritz is seen by almost all of us in the field as one of our sources, as one of the seminal writers in the field. And he may be a little less accessible, except the Pfafford and Mauser stories. His science fiction is extremely sophisticated and requires a certain input from the reader. And his serious science fiction that the casual reader probably doesn't get as much out of. The anthologies I was doing did not make any allowance for that. I mean, I used a lot of authors I used very little Asimov or Clarke.
That's what Fritz Leiber is. Fritz is the icon toward which we all aspire.
How familiar are you with his works?
It would probably be bragging to say that I've read every word that I've been able to lay my hands on of Fritz Leiber's work, but in fact that's true. I first read Fritz's work even before I knew there was such a thing as fantasy writing. I read a story called The Girl with the Hungry Eyes that was published in an original anthology of fantasy stories back in, 1948, 49, something. I had a little Avon paperback, and I looked at this story and said, this is an amazing piece of work. And thereafter, I watched for the name Fritz Leiber, and I've read everything that I've ever been able to find by Fritz Leiber. I've read all his books that have been published, and many of them I've read more than once. Our Lady of Darkness, every time I feel that my work is not as good as it should be, I go back and I read that book. I just dip into it and I'll read a page or 2 or 5 and say, yes, this is how you try and do it. And if you can't do it this well, you ought to go back to bricklaying.
One of the biggest kicks for me is knowing that I helped spark a story.
And which story was that?
The Ghost Light. I was at a crafts fair and I saw these little stained glass night lights, and I said, how nice. Fritz could use one of those for when he's up wandering in the middle of the night and goes to make coffee. So I bought him the prettiest one I could find. It's like peacock blue and green. And he took it home and plugged it in, and something about the color combination was frightening. So he wrote the whole story about this frightening little nightlight.
Fritz had loads of fans around. They really loved him, and he'd always invite them and give them coffee and sit around and shoot the breeze. And this is extended over a period of years and years.
It's a definitely colorful following.
That's true. Whoops.
A lot of, no pun intended.
No pun intended.
Yeah. A lot of Fritz's fans and friends were in the neo-pagan movement.
Yes, that's true.
Would you like to talk about that a little bit, his involvement with that?
Well, he's a member of a coven. He was a member of a coven.
Subway chicken. Subway chicken with the dog. You have a steamer. I'm somewhere.
But was Fritz a neo-pagan? I don't think so. I think Fritz was an agnostic. I think he had always been an agnostic, very much in the tradition of Lovecraft. And his original background was a scientific background. But I think he thought that neo-paganism was very colorful and interesting, and the people were fascinating, and he was fond of them.
To the things and spirits of light, to the things and spirits of darkness. When man first strode out of his ochred cave, a host of gods came with him from the dark, puissant guards with powers beyond the grave. But light is cruel to gods, the awful spark of knowledge flared, and man must watch each die until but one was left upon his throne, and that one shrunken to a puerile lie, and man must face the aching void alone. In nature are strange, haunting cries that seem to voice the heart of solitude. The mourning of the dove, the seahawk's scream, hoot of the owl through woods that drearily brood, howl of the wolf under the sky's gray span. Last of these lonely cries, the voice of man. Poor little ape, you're sick again tonight. Has the shrill, fretful chatter fevered you? Was it a dreamland gave you such a fright? And did the serpent fear glide from the slough? You cough, you moan. I hear your small teeth grate. What are those words you mutter as you toss? War, torture, guilt, revenge, crime, murder, hate. I'll stroke your brow, poor little ape, your cross. Far wiser beasts under far older stars, have had your sickness, seen their hopes denied, sought fate, found God, pounded against the bars, and like you, little ape, they someday died. The bow swings in the wind. The night is deep. Look at the stars, poor little ape, and sleep.
In my estimation, Fritz Leiber is one of the great American writers. And when I say great, I mean on the first rank along with, I don't know, Melville and Mark Twain and Ambrose Bierce and Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, this is a writer who is a classic writer. He is for eternity.
And you think this is one of the things that makes Fritz a great American writer, or do you?
Whatever makes him a great writer is whatever it is that's in the work. All you have to do is read anything of his, the least of his stories, Sings. There's an understanding of the music that is great literature in what he writes. And the wonderful thing about it is that he does it so simply. It's like Fred Astaire's dancing. He does it with such panache and such elegance and such simplicity that you think, well, I could do that, and you try it and you fall flat on your ass, which is what it's all about too, because you really are not as good as Fritz Leiber. None of us is. He is the best of us all.
Thank you for watching our tribute to Fritz Leiber. For over 50 years, he has blessed his readers with amazing stories of high adventure,
bone-chilling horror, biting satire,
Fantastic worlds.
and so many memorable characters. We all agree with Harlan Ellison. Fritz Leiber has claimed his place in the first rank as one of America's greatest writers.